Well, welcome. It's great to see you all here. Thank you for coming, all of you who are here in the room and everybody online on Zoom. Welcome to the 2026 IAWA Symposium, Christine Fallon Research Prize edition. We are delighted today to host the recipient of the 2026 Christine Fallon Research Prize, Kate Malaya, and learn about her research on Ukrainian women architects, followed by a presentation by our colleague from the WAC, Elizabeth Keslacey, on her research on Californian women architects. The Christine Fallon Research Prize is a biennial prize of $5,000 that seeks to highlight or promote original research into groups of women or individual women in different regions of the world who made contributions to the disciplines and built environment, yet remain inappropriately documented or attributed. The prize is generously endowed in perpetuity by Christine Fallon, who's a VT alumna and a long-term advisor of the IAWA, who developed a unique practice in Chicago. I'm going to offer now a short bio for Christine Fallon. She's a pioneer in applying information technology to architecture, engineering, construction, and facility management since the 1970s. After 15 years leading IT strategy and deployment in large firms like SOM in Chicago, she founded Christine Fallon Associates, Inc. in 1993 to consult on the use of IT in the design and construction industry. In 2004, she completed a major research study for the Curatorial Department of Architecture of the Art Institute of Chicago, titled Collecting, Archiving, and Exhibiting Digital Design Data, which defined techniques for the collecting and long-term archiving of born digital design data created by architects and industrial designers. I would like to first introduce Christine Fallon.
Thank you, Paula, and hello, Katrina. I am always thankful for having decided to do the Christine Fallon Prize because I'm amazed at what knowledge it can produce. And I will say that I am humbled by how provincial my view was of what caused women to be visible or invisible in architecture until I read Katrina's paper, which is a wonderful paper. And I also want to congratulate Katrina or thank her. The research she did going to obscure archives with disorganized, unindexed, paper documents, and digging through those documents to find this information is just incredible. The IAWA is privileged and delighted to be the recipient of this research. Thank you very, very much, Katrina, for your work.
And thank you, Christine, for facilitating and sponsoring this kind of research. So I'm going to now do a brief presentation for Katerina and then allow her to share with us her work. Katerina Kate Malaya, PhD, is an architectural historian and educator teaching at Kharkiv School of Architecture and the University of Utah. She researches ordinary architectures, particularly housing, under pressure and in times of change. Her first book, Taking the Soviet Union Apart, Room by Room, published by Cornell, was published in 2023. Her book, Mass Housing in Ukraine, published by Dome Publishers, was published in September 2024. Her co-edited volume, Protests Beyond the Plaza, co-edited with Nathan Mark Hudson, was published by Routledge in February of this year. The 2026 edition of the Christine Fallon Prize focused on women, conflict, and architecture, centered on women working in trying circumstances, negotiating repressive political, economic, environmental, or cultural conditions. The awarded essay, Missing Women, Ukrainian Architects of the 1930s, is an important contribution to this history, much of which is still unknown. Please join me in welcoming Katerina Malaya.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, it is an honor for me, and thank you so much to the International Archive of Women in Architecture, and thank you so much, Christine, for establishing this award and also for your kind words about my paper. Can you hear me okay? It's the most important question. I'm going to share some slides. I might need a permission to do that.
No, I think you should be able to.
I think it should work. And let's go to this. So you should be able to see my slides now. I would like to start with the central question of my study. In Soviet Ukraine, many women architects entered the profession in the 1920s and 1930s. Why is it then that there are so few recognized Soviet Ukrainian women architects from that era? From here, I'm going to walk you through my almost detective investigation that became possible thanks to Kristen Fallon Price, leading to a set of answers that illustrate this notoriously complicated, often contradictory gender dynamic within the professional fields under socialism, the devastation of World War II, and also there's an unexpected colonial twist that's going to come at the end of this talk. I first became interested in this topic while looking at the 1939 March issue of the architecture journal Архітектура радянської України, or Architecture of Soviet Ukraine, dedicated to International Women's Day. This special issue highlighted dozens of women working in architecture and planning. These women joined the workforce as most formal barriers were raised under the Soviet agenda of women's liberation from kitchen slavery to merge them into the workforce. Beginning in the early 1920s, hundreds of women enrolled in architecture programs in Kiev and Kharkiv and then later in Odessa, and started practicing architecture in Soviet Ukrainian design institutes. By 1939, 700 members, or 13% of all Soviet Architects Union members, were women. Despite this impressive number, only a few from this generation are widely remembered. In my study, I looked at both known and entirely forgotten women architects to recover what was possible about their biographies, understand their lives and professional path, and ultimately bring their names back from oblivion. But no less importantly, I aim to outline and understand archival silences. In Venus in Two Acts, Saidiya Hartman writes about the nearly impossible task of constructing history and reinstating enslaved Black women's personhood in the absence of an archive. Quote, "How can narrative embody life in words and at the same time respect what we cannot know?" End quote. Jumping ahead, my investigation reveals that even for those who should have been well documented, a traditional archive is a fragile matter and by no means a guarantee of a place in history. But first, let me tell you what is in the archives about this pioneering generation of women in architecture. Between 1935 and 1941, Ukrainian architectural journals published multiple articles to highlight women in the profession and promote their achievements. These articles were sometimes dedicated to individual women, sometimes to women working in specific design institutions, or to women in architecture at large. Some articles were also focused on certain architectural typologies connected to care and viewed as quote-unquote feminine in the USSR, so schools, kindergartens, and hospitals. Very few similar publications came out after the end of World War II, although women remained widely present in architecture. For example, in the 1950s, about 200 members of the Union of Architects of just Ukrainian SSR alone were women. Even when post-war architecture journals did focus on women, the format of the articles changed. In 1951, the newsletter of the Architecture Academy of the Ukrainian SSR published an issue dedicated to women. However, unlike in the 1930s, This was no longer about women in architecture per se. It was more so just a platform for different women to highlight their specific research, but not women-specific research. These changes clearly reflect the shifts in Soviet gender policy. At the start of the Soviet state in 1917, women's rights and criticism of the traditional nuclear family were at the core of the communist reforms and discourse. The first 1918 set of Soviet laws regarding family and marriage provided women with the right to vote, whether the elections were real or not, an equal right to property in the marriage, and a right to seek divorce on grounds much more lenient than prior to the revolution. Special women's sections of the Communist Party were created in 1919 to address women's rights. Newly Soviet cities introduced state-controlled food distribution, focused on canteens instead of home cooking, attempted and for the most part failed at laundry services instead of domestic laundry, daycares, and even 24/7 or weekday boarding nurseries instead of child-rearing at home. Even the very necessity of a nuclear family and marriage was in question for a while, because women were supposed to join the workforce and that was the priority. Yet this initial push towards work and home equality was over by the 1930s. The party's rhetoric changed from advancement of women's rights to simply claiming women were already equal within the Soviet society. By the height of Stalin's rule, abortion bans were reintroduced, this is 1936, to cement this questionable equality in legal terms. Yet, women's professional labor remained just as important to the state as ever under the industrial growth agenda. To avoid losing women to the domestic sphere, the state not only facilitated their employment, but it also intensified its efforts to promote women workers in the popular media. The articles of the 1930s that came on the wave of this promotion are particularly valuable. They not only provide information, but make it possible to outline archival silences. While practically none of the women portrayed in the 1930s articles are commonly remembered today, we at least know some of their names. Some of their biographies can be traced through existing archives with relative precision, but the biographies of many others remain absolutely obscure. A good example of a woman prominently featured in the 1930s publications and almost entirely absent in later sources is Odessa architect Sfir Bernstein, the author of multiple projects in Odessa. As a young architect, she was celebrated with a personal article in Architecture of Soviet Ukraine for her landscape designs. In the 1930s, Bernstein co-authored the reconstruction of Odessa Academic Drama Theater, of the Central Park of Culture and Recreation, today it's called Shevchenko Park in Odessa, and also its Green Theater, the extension of the Dew Garden, and Odessa Cathedral Square reconstruction after Bolsheviks demolished the cathedral it was named after. Although, according to her grave at the Third Jewish Cemetery in Odessa, she lived until 1991, she was no longer featured in the publications of the 40s or 50s or 60s. This does not mean that she was not active in the profession. On the contrary, Soviet secondary sources very briefly credit her for authoring educational, recreational, and residential master plans and buildings in Odessa, but all of them far from the city center. These were typically humble worker settlements, such as the Sailor Settlement branching off Dusdorska Road between Topolina Street and Levitana Street. It is known that she participated in developing the 1966 Master Plan of Odessa, but since she was a part of a team at a large organization, her contribution is hardly recognized. Sadly, her individual designs from the 30s are either lost or not remembered. The Soviet demolished cathedral was rebuilt in the late 1990s and also recently bombed by the Russians, which is quite ironic in its own way. And also the Green Theater was in disrepair for a while and was then rebuilt without much authentic thinking. The worker settlements of the 1940s are not seen as worthy of much architectural attention at all. So Sfir Bernstein's name at the end is little known after World War II, and it did not carry enough weight to protect or promote her work. In 1931, young architect Tamara Volkoboy graduated from Kiev Construction Institute and began working at the State Transportation Design Institute. By 33, she transitioned to civil construction and worked on residential and public buildings and a kindergarten together with another architect, Marina Pogrebinska, who will also come up in this story. After her work for the Civil Construction Institute, she joined the design studios of the Ministry of Health of the Ukrainian SSR, and there worked on some of her most important and best-known projects. Hospitals, including the reconstruction and addition to the Lutheran Community Hospital in Kiev, and serial standard projects for child cares. A child care she developed in 1936 was built hundreds of times throughout Ukraine. Her transition followed the political shift as the party pushed to build not only the industry itself, but the spaces that sustain the industry by housing, treating, and supporting reproduction of workers, all while keeping women in the industrial workforce even as they gave birth. The architectural implications of this political shift were immediate. To resolve the contradiction between women both working outside of the home and having children, in the second five-year economic period, which is 1933 to 1937, Soviets began building childcares on a previously unseen scale. In Kiev, quote, 12 schools were built in 1935, but already 33 were built in 1936, end quote. In the Ukrainian SSR altogether, quote, 42 maternal wards and 174 early childcare facilities, end quote, were built in 1939 alone. The scale of construction is visible in Ukrainian cities until this day. For example, most schools found in central Kiev neighborhoods developed prior to the 1950s were built in the 1930s as part of this school building campaign. In Ukraine, several organizations took on school projects, but one called Shkil Project, which literally just means school project, of the People's Commissariat of Education, focused predominantly on schools, colleges, and child cares. In the late 1930s, Shkil Project's team consisted mostly of women. Maria Kostenko, Mira Perlmutter, Marina Pogrebinska, and Nina Manucharova, to name a few. Since this school construction had to happen on a massive scale, projects were developed in this standard serial method without a specific address. They could be endlessly replicable throughout appropriate climate zones, urban and rural destinations. Between 1935 and 41, the team of Shkil developed dozens of school designs, often under the typical Stalin-era pressure to build better and faster, and also receiving a lot of criticism. The school building campaign, however, and the careers of the many women who worked to realize it were both interrupted by World War II. The former members of Shkil Project, Maria Kostenko and Marina Pogrebinska, survived the war. This is evident in their post-war projects and their archival presence. Maria Kostenko was a member of the union. Her member case was properly archived, so her professional trajectory is not hard to trace. Marina Pogrebinska's case cannot be found, actually. However, she worked on several significant projects that allow us to see that she was alive after World War II, but they are now sadly obscure as well. Pogrebinska's case is actually a fascinating example of an intertwined oblivion of both the author and the building. She was prominent enough after World War II to work on signature Stalin-era buildings in Kiev, including this plaza-forming dormitory buildings at the corner of Mechnikova Street and Pechersky Descent. It's Pechersk neighborhood of Kiev, central Kiev. This post-war building now stands abandoned and for sale, claiming it can be demolished, despite also being under review for landmark status. Stalin-era buildings are not rare in Kiev, but most buildings that have strong street or plaza-forming presence are in good shape and well regarded by Kievites. At least within the architectural community, it is common to know their authors' names. When those names are of prominent men, Dobrovolsky, Primak, Malinovsky, and others. Marina Pogrebinska, on the contrary, is not remembered, despite her work at the time, and her name does not add weight to the preservation case for her buildings. Looping back a little bit, at the end of the war, Tamara Volkoboy, the author of the childcare buildings, transitioned from education and healthcare design to an organization named Ukrdipro, which dealt with planning and designs for rural places. Considering war damage and the grand Soviet project of village relocation to enlarge successful collective farms and rural industrial enterprises, the need for these designs was great. Between 44 and 65, when she retired, she developed over a dozen projects for villages in Lviv, Odessa, Poltava, Cherkasy, Mykolaiv regions, and even in Kazakhstan. However, by the nature of these designs, rural planning, far from cultural centers, they did not bring her fame. Unlike in Soviet Estonia, where rural designs became the space of experimentation away from ideologically controlled centers, Ukrainian rural designs were not regarded as particularly prestigious, especially not in the later Soviet decades. When she is remembered these days, the projects discussed are always from the 1930s, especially her reconstruction of the Lutheran Community Hospital in Kyiv, a landmark in the central city that permits for the agency of the architect to be seen. Another domain, another cluster of knowledge is that is important to this conversation is on planning and housing. In the 1930s, multiple women architects entered the profession by working in planning, and particularly at the central planning institution called Dipromisto. Women were widely present in Dipromisto from the very start. 1930s photographs of Dipromisto collective show a striking gender balance. Out of 91 employees portrayed, over 50 were women. A 1940 article about Dipromisto listed multiple women, including planners Alla Ivanova, Antonina Borisenko, Olga Arkhipova, Lyubov Plotker, Tamara Guzenko, Natalia Panchuk, and that's just a few. And I'm naming them because I think at a certain point it's important to simply name these people who we know so little about. Yet the urban planners of early Dipromisto, even more than the architects of other organizations, suffer from group work obscurity in contemporary Ukrainian architectural history. These architects and planners worked in teams, and a city or a large village plan is perhaps even harder to associate with a single author. Moreover, a lot of the work of the 1930s had to be reconsidered in the late 40s and 50s due to war damage and due to the even faster post-war growth and evolution of the Soviet cities and aesthetic tastes of Soviet political elites. Due to the fluidity of architectural practice between urban and building scale, this is a special Soviet Union feature, after World War II, many of the Dipromisto women became involved in work on serial mass housing at the level of a street, a microrayon, this micro neighborhood, and even an individual building. For example, early in her successful yet little remembered career, architect Alla Ivanova designed individual residential buildings in Kharkiv. By the 1930s, she worked as a planner in the most classical sense of the word. She had a Dipromisto studio developing master plans for Ukrainian cities Kherson, Mariupol, Slavyansk, Kropivnitsky, Kremenchuk, and Borlivka. After the end of the war, however, she also focused on housing and planning and urban design, particularly working on the capacity of the so-called housing series, these standard projects meant for mass construction, to address street needs for vertical dominance and corners and the street silhouette. This reflects the general state of Soviet planning at the time. The effort of transition to a non-address serial construction that began in the 1920s has matured by the 1950s, and the planners' practice accordingly changed to focus on serial designs at the planning scale. From the post-war 1950s concerned with reconstruction, through the following Soviet decades focused on the never-ending housing shortage, the object of this practice was largely housing. Besides the porous boundaries of the planning and serial housing design fields, which we could, in modern terms, we could call this quality interdisciplinarity. There was something else in common between those fields. Professionals working in both of these fields tended to receive less public recognition than architects who worked on individual projects. This is equally true for the many Dipronista women who were involved in the quote-unquote heroic effort of post-war reconstruction, serving the ruined cities under harsh conditions, sometimes when the cities were very recently reconquered. I guess to add a little bit of detail to what it means to survey destruction in ruined cities, there could still be a lot of explosives that were not cleared of these sites, and you already have to survey them. The reason I know is because we're dealing with that in Ukraine, right? This work did not bring them fame. In those rare instances when women architects and planners gained attention for this work, they headed important studios or entire administrations, like the planner Lydia Dmitrievska, who was not only one of the first architects to work on the plans of post-World War II reconstruction of Zaporizhia, but also the head architect of multiple pre- and post-war Zaporizhia master plans. Now I'd like to discuss research instead of practice as one of the possible professional paths. Not all women pictured in the 1930s photographs that I showed you continued traditional practice after World War II. The Ukrainian Academy of Architecture was founded in 1945, providing an alternative research path for architectural professionals. The careers of two women architects are particularly illustrative. The relatively famous Nina Manucharova and the virtually forgotten Feofania, also known as Faina Miletitska. Unlike most previously discussed women, Nina Manucharova is visible in both design and architectural history. In the 1940s, she was the only woman out of 15 board members of the Union of Architecture of the Ukrainian SSR. Around the same time, she was also the head of the architecture department of the Council of the Ministers of Ukrainian SSR, the highest-ranking Ukrainian woman architect of the 1940s. But the trajectory of her successful career is also very peculiar. By the 30s, she was a promising young architect, having designed a couple of famous stadiums, public buildings, and the streamlined modern childcare at Institutska Street in central Kyiv, and also many projects for mass construction. During the war, she evacuated to Russia and continued working as an architect there until the Soviets retook Ukraine. By the late 40s, despite the clear need for practicing architects in post-war reconstruction, the need was in fact so clear that Soviets forgave architects for a lot of things that happened under occupation, just to have them in the field. Despite this need, she transitioned to research and emerged as a major authority in vernacular architecture, decorative art, and interior design theory. She had a degree of fame, but her buildings were not so lucky. Manucharova's Dynamo Stadium in Kyiv was partly destroyed during World War II. Her many serial projects of rural clubs are practically anonymous. Her childcare at Institutska Street, it's a particularly sad story. It survived and is still standing, except it has been ruthlessly remodeled and features no recognition of her agency whatsoever, not even of the real construction date. Currently, it is a business center that claims its construction date as 2003, perhaps to not scare away potential renters with its real age. Despite Manucharova's success during her lifetime, her name has been largely erased from her building legacy until lately, when new efforts such as women Wikipedia architecture have emerged in the Ukrainian public domain. Her colleague and classmate Faina Miletitska is virtually unknown. Like Manucharova, she entered the profession by studying at Kyiv Architecture Institute in 1923 and graduated in 1930. They were classmates and clearly friends. By the mid-1930s, together with her husband, architect Petro Kostyrko, she participated in several very famous constructions, including Rulit House in Kyiv for the member of the Writers' Union and Taras Shevchenko Memorial Museum in Kyiv. She also took central part in the planning of Kyiv and Vinnytsia redevelopment. Actively making a name for herself until the 1930s, she fell sick and became temporarily bedridden in 1934. Due to her mobility issues, or at least so she explains in her autobiography, she was unable to evacuate Kyiv when it was occupied by the Germans in 1941. She stayed with her relatives in the village and remained under occupation until Kyiv was retaken by the Soviets in 1943. For a Soviet citizen, staying under Nazi occupation was likely to present problems in the future. All women architects who stayed had to provide excuses as to why, in autobiographies compiled for work and union membership. Despite this complication, both Milititska and her husband were able to return to Kiev and work after the war. However, she never returned to design. Instead, she joined the Academy of Architecture and under Manucharova's leadership was mostly working in ethnography and object design and sort of working with these folk motives in architecture, which was part of Stalin's campaign to appropriate folk aesthetic in both art and architecture in every republic, not just Ukraine. Until now, I have mostly talked about women's disadvantages in the profession. But there were also some advantages and of course an element of nepotism. Especially in the first generation of Ukrainian women architects, a good number were daughters of already well-established male architects prominent in the early Soviet Union. The prime example is Olga Alyoshina, the daughter of Pavlo Alyoshin, one of the most famous Soviet Ukrainian architects of the time. But besides Alyoshina, there were many others. Evgenia Marinchenko, the very well-celebrated author of Palats Ukraina concert hall, was the daughter of established architect Alexander Marinchenko. Natalia Holostenko was the daughter of the famous Mykola Holostenko, and so on. This is not to say that all female architects benefited from their familial ties with male architects. Architectural dynasties are common in Ukraine until this day, perhaps so common that they should not be considered much of a factor in an architect's success. Yet the familial affiliation between architects cannot be disregarded either. It is not uncommon that architects worked on the same project as families, where both the husband and wife were involved, like in the reconstruction of the Shevchenko Museum, where Petro Kostyrko was the architect on file, while his wife, Fania Milititska, was involved not once, but twice. First during the construction, and then during the reconstruction of this building after World War II. Despite her work, she is not credited absolutely anywhere, except for her own biographic notes. Other women architects, like Olga Klint, did not get a chance to practice with their husbands after the war, because their architect husbands were mobilized and died in World War II. The young and promising Natalia Onatska almost disappeared after the war. It is only clear that she managed to survive based on several post-war planning projects of a hydroelectric station settlement she worked on at a little-known design institute. It is hard to tell what exactly happened to Natalia Onatska. Yet there's something visible in the archives, namely that Onatska's father, a famous Sumy artist and historian Nikonor Onatsky, was denounced as the enemy of the people and executed in 1937 at the height of Stalin's purges. Being the daughter of the people's enemy may not have completely banned her from architecture, but may have very negatively affected her career. Family ties may have helped or hurt them, but their union membership was exclusively useful for women in architecture. During the toughest years of the war, being a part of the union entailed a decent food ration. Moreover, in 1944, the Council of People's Commissars of the Soviet Union issued a decree to extend the favorable housing regulations previously reserved to scientists to also include the members of the Architects' Union. The war had taken a toll on already stretched housing resources, forcing more urbanites into crowded communal apartments, basements, and barracks. Many architects had left major Ukrainian cities during the occupation, were there to evacuate deep into the Soviet rear, like Nina Manucharova, Tamara Budyanska, Rosa Balaban, and Ida Persova, for example, or to join the army, like Olga Alyoshina, or to stay with rural relatives further from the front line, but still on occupied territories, like Fania Milititska. If they survived the war and were union members, this rule meant returning to the city was an easier affair, and that their living conditions were better than most urbanites had to endure. Many of them were able to find fairly decent residences. While some women who were able or willing to evacuate east and not stay under occupation continued their professional practice and further advanced their resumes, those who stayed under occupation typically had a major work break in their careers, in addition to the general suffering of wartime. For instance, while Nina Manucharova worked as an architect and engineer in Zlatoust and Kuybyshev, which is current-day Samara in Russia, Stefania Mletitska, quote, performed some landscape and portrait painting commissions and embroidery, end quote. Leaving a city under attack was often contingent upon job-related evacuation trains, whereas architecture institutions were not necessarily considered important enough to be evacuated as a whole collective of employees. Many women could not leave because they were sole caretakers for elderly and young children, especially if their husbands were already drafted to the army. Underemployment or taking odd jobs instead of architectural practice was typical for women architects under occupation. For example, architect Maria Konopleva wrote that she was unable to evacuate Kharkiv in 1941 with her elderly mother and young daughter. According to her autobiography in the Union file, under occupation she worked as a laborer. When Kharkiv was briefly retaken by the Soviets in February 1943, she again did not leave and worked as a seamstress at a children's underwear factory until the final retaking of Kharkiv by the Soviets in August 1943. After this final change of hands, she immediately returned to the profession and began working at the head architect's office and later in Diplomisto. So clearly she was a highly qualified professional, but she was not able to work professionally under occupation, or even if she was, she would have never mentioned it after the Soviets returned because that would have been a punishable offense. For many women architects, the war presented a lifelong tragedy, or at the very least, a lasting challenge. Many, like Maria Konopleva and Olga Quint, lost not only years of their careers, but also their husbands and relatives. Those who stayed in the occupied territories had to explain what they did under occupation until the end of their lives. Yet the end of the war also presented a professional opportunity. Reconstruction needs were dire, so many women architects joined groups that either worked on urban reconstruction at the planning scale of new housing typologies at the architectural scale, and in most cases these were again group projects, powered by large studios within established institutions such as Diplomisto, Kyiv Project, or Kyivznie. The employees of these organizations who developed these projects serving millions of people were largely unknown due to the collective and non-address nature of this practice. It is not a uniquely Ukrainian Soviet phenomenon. It is also true for a lot of socialist contexts, and there's a wonderful article by Ingrid Rudy about this. The 1930s publications that were the very start of my story, celebrating the arrival of Soviet women in the architectural profession, created an odd discontinuity. After the war, formal Soviet discourse seemingly lost interest in women in architecture, and this indifference persisted for decades, dooming the 1930s women architects to obscurity. Some progress and remembrance was made in 2016 when the National Architecture and Construction Library of Ukraine, together with the Ukrainian organization Urban Forms Center, held a conference titled Modernistki, which is Ukrainian for women modernists, and compiled a bibliographic guide on Ukrainian women architects. However, this project largely focused on the most familiar names, such as Evgenia Marinchenko and the younger, mostly post-World War II architect Natalia Chmutina. A lot of new research on Ukrainian modernism features women architects, but again, it's also largely the architects whose biographies are easily reconstructible. In other words, the only Soviet women architects remembered today from that period are those who survived the war, those whose careers peaked after 1945, and whose buildings are in plain sight. The archival silences get louder before World War II, and the prime victims of this loss are the women whose careers started in the pre-war decade. War, therefore, is not just a breaking point for the entire professional generation, but also an important watershed in remembrance. Archival data from the 1930s and 1940s is actually often missing. But there are some particularly disappointing cases, such as the lack of documents of the Union of Architects from before the war. The Union was established in between 1936 and 37, and has not changed much since, except for turning into an independent Ukrainian institution in 1991. Yet the absolute majority of surviving archival materials are from 1944 and later. Moreover, the union members' personal cases, which is an excellent document for reconstructing an architect's professional path, are entirely missing before 1956, although they were initiated in 36, 20 years earlier. The two archives that hold the majority of member cases do not have institutional memory long enough to know why those archives are missing. The clue is found in Di Promisto archives at that planning institute. Anniversary volumes on Di Promisto's long history, internally published in 1990, state that archives were evacuated to the Orenburg region of Russia as Germans were approaching Ukrainian cities during the war. As far as the current day archivists can tell, those archives were never returned. We don't even know they made it to their destination, so they're basically just gone entirely. This is also confirmed in the post-World War II speech by Nina Manucharova at an all-Soviet exhibition of women architects' achievements, where she says that Ukrainian SSR could not provide much material because all of our archives were lost. Colonial voids are virtually inescapable when working on Ukrainian history, even when the subject has nothing to do with anti-colonial resistance or, Soviet crimes per se. In conclusion, there is an aspect of this work that did not make it to my essay but has stuck with me as the single most emotional part of the investigation. A few months ago, I was able to look at the archival documents of the Union of the Architects from between 1943 and 1945. That is when the Soviets were already taking Ukrainian cities back from the Germans, but the war was nowhere near over. Women architects of the deoccupied cities immediately joined the reconstruction effort that at first was primarily the gruesome task of documenting or surveying damage. Although the tide has already turned in favor of the USSR, they did not know how or when the war would end. Some women architects and the majority of their husbands were still at the front line. No one knew whether they would return, and jumping ahead, many of them did not. To look at these documents right now, today in Ukraine, is uncannily familiar. We are at war defending our land. This war is not nearly over, and we do not know how it will end. Many architects are at the front line. Many are already dead or missing in action. Many more may not return. Someday this war will be over, but we may not be there to see it. But for as long as we are here, we will not be silent. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. Thank you, Kate. That was just amazing. Wonderful. We have some time now for Q&A. I understand that I don't need to move this little thing? No? Okay. So does anybody have questions here in the room, or is there anybody online? Ashley, that has questions?
Paula?
Yes. Oh. Yes. Hi, Claire.
Hi. Katerina, I have asked this several times before. Is there any way that IAWA could be helpful to Ukrainian women architects right now? Could they somehow help them save their archives or pay for the postage to send the stuff to Virginia? Or is there anything that we could do to facilitate something?
Claire, this is a fascinating question. I can't speak on behalf of archival institutions, but there are several initiatives on digitizing what we do have, and they're actually moving along pretty quickly. There is, if you're ever interested in looking at what's been digitized, the search engine is not perfect like always, but there is an inter-archival portal that now lists the materials of all the archives that have been digitized in Ukraine to date, and they keep adding stuff really, really quickly, region by region. I'm not quite sure about the funding. I've heard different stories about where the funding is coming from, but it's most likely an international attempt to digitize archives. For women in architecture specifically, there is no separate institution per se. What I did here was basically going through a bunch of places and picking things crumb by crumb where I could find something. The archives of some union cases are actually already digitized. Some union cases will not be digitized due to copyright issues. Another question is like what can be digitized according to the internal regulations of archives. But at least those are in Kyiv. In terms of the archives closer to the front line, honestly, I do not know. It's a whole different problem of essentially that's a question to ask people from those regions who either already moved those archives or they cannot be moved anymore because at a certain point life is more valuable than archives.
I can understand that completely.
Kind of an absurd situation.
It was just an issue that has come up over the past few years that I felt anyway very strongly that if we could do something, we should do it. And I don't know how to communicate to the Ukraine. I've heard it's dangerous for them. So if you can do anything and you think
I'm
we
more
can...
than happy to look into this and to continue this conversation, yes, and connect you to the right people.
Super, thank you.
Other questions? Thoughts?
Hello, maybe you can hear me. I don't know if I'm
Yes.
looking in the right camera.
You are.
Rebecca Chestnut is my name, and I would just like to say to Katarina, thank you very much. I had the opportunity to visit Kyiv at least 3 times before the Russian war of aggression began, when it was a time of hope and optimism, to a certain extent even maybe. I don't want to go too far, but I was invited exactly by that Congress of Women that you showed in your last slide. I think it was their second Congress, and they were fighting for avoiding the destructive influence of investment, development, purely capitalistically driven investments that were creating actually slum situations, because you had this whole problem of gentrification going the wrong way. Anyway, I wanted to just simply thank you for your presence, for your bringing the background of the Ukrainian women's initiatives in architectural thought and practice to the forefront through your paper. And I don't have a question at this moment in time, but I just wanted to let you know I have a certain familiarity with your context. That's it. I'm speaking from Berlin. I'm an architect in Berlin, Germany, and maybe that's a little bit of the connection. Maybe we could just exchange thoughts down the road a little bit.
Thank you. That is wonderful. And those initiatives are extremely important. What was happening in 2016 is extremely important.
Absolutely.
We sort of have to keep moving.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
Yes. Yes, go ahead.
I'll stand up. My name is Abigail. I'm wondering, since we're on the topic of initiatives, what would you encourage the current student body to do to help with archival work and going forward as we enter the profession? Do you have any specific warnings or calls to action for us moving forward?
That's an excellent question, thank you. I guess with this specific work, and what's probably just very personal to me, because I look into a lot of ordinary architectures as well, even if there's no formal archive, that doesn't mean that something cannot be studied. Or somebody, I guess this paper was a little bit of a step out of a comfort zone for me, because I typically don't look into personalities in architectural history. And I think the reason I was attracted to this so much was specifically because the archive was not on the surface. Information was hard to find, and the picture is not fully reconstructible. But the fact that it's not fully reconstructible in painstaking detail doesn't mean that it's not worth looking at. So I think take on challenging projects and figure out ways to work on subjects that are not on the surface and that don't seem to have clear sources. That's, if I have an advice, that's it.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat from Michael. Katerina, thank you for your important work. How can the future of reconstruction of Ukraine prevent the mistakes of post-World War II reconstruction by ensuring that women in architecture get proper recognition? Is there a fear that the collective design process in modern practice will once again bury the contributions of women in architecture?
No, the collective practice is to some degree, at least the socialist form of the collective practice that is large design institutions is gone. So is serial construction method. So that as such is not necessarily a danger anymore. When it comes to reconstruction, I'd say the main danger really is just prioritizing developer interests over planning and over architectural expertise. And also, perhaps another danger is sort of taking, I would say, taking normative models of reconstruction or of development that already exist, particularly in the West, and applying them to Ukrainian context without enough research and without enough thinking about what we're actually dealing with. Another problem, of course, is when we talk about reconstruction in Ukraine, at first, in 22 and even in 23, we were talking about it as some sort of a post-war phenomenon, that after the war is over, there's going to be some sort of a reconstruction. We no longer think like that. At this point, any reconstruction that can happen is going to be happening during the war. So it's going to be a very different scale. The kind of damage we're dealing with is the kind of damage that we're dealing with that is reconstructible right now is usually on a much smaller scale, often to infrastructure. When it comes to housing, for example, it's usually something on the scale of a number of buildings in the city, not the entire city that is leveled. Because cities that are leveled and villages that are leveled are literally at the front line. You can't touch them. This is not something that can be dealt with right this moment, or they are occupied, which is even worse, and Russians are apparently reconstructing something out there, but it's bizarre at the very least. So I guess women not getting lost in this process is probably just, let's say the current situation in Ukraine is not necessarily prohibitive for women architects. They certainly participate. In fact, while males are yet again on the front line, women now are a major force in a lot of professions, not just in architecture. And generally, it's fairly gender balanced. But there's always the glass ceiling, and the glass ceiling didn't go away. So I guess I don't have a good answer to your question of how can we help prevent the mistakes of mid-20th century. But I have some hope.
Thank you for your answer. Appreciate it.
Yes.
Yeah, I had a question. Hi, Kate. I'm Elizabeth. Thank you so much for the paper. My question, really is sort of interested in the context that you gave of sort of like early Soviet life being quite, in a way, emancipatory for women, and then a sort of later shift back to traditions which were less interested in women's liberation. And I was curious, I guess, how you saw that affecting the architects that you discuss. Were women sort of no longer welcome in some of those kind of bureaucratic jobs, or was it more of a, I guess, like, how did that context affect them? Do you know?
Yes, I think I have an answer to your question. Thank you, Elizabeth. First of all, the glass ceiling, and this is true for pretty much every former socialist state. Women were technically welcome. In reality, they very rarely occupied any high positions, decision-making positions. There would usually be some for representational purposes, but it would not be balanced with the number of people in the workforce, with the number of women versus men in the workforce. What happened in the 1930s specifically is absolutely fascinating. I actually elaborated on that a little bit in the essay and sort of skipped it here, because despite the rollback to these traditional gender roles and domestication of women under Stalin, the Soviets need them so desperately in the industry that they just keep releasing more and more materials, more and more media presence of women, and advertising women in the professions, women who are somehow perfect mothers, but also at the same time perfect workers, with an extremely high yield of whatever it is, that it's steel, sugar beets, or buildings, serial designs, and sort of promoting that women's presence in workforce. So that is different from other contexts where that sort of rollback to traditionalism happened. They had to have women in the workforce, so they did everything they could to keep them there. And then after World War II, the situation changes somewhat. The generation changes. The generation that is there after World War II to rebuild the country is basically all the same women who are already professionals, already in the workforce, and there are no men, or very few men, for the first couple of years. And this is something that we rarely think about, but the war technically ends in 45, right? But it doesn't mean that men come back. Men are still in the army. Some are in the army until 46, some are in the army until 48. The representatives of civilian professions who would later go back to their civilian professions. But in the first year after World War II, most of the work is done by women.
Builds on that, and you started to maybe answer it. This is sure thank you, Kate. After the war in the 50s, 60s, did there continue to be a large amount of women educated in architecture, or were those paths also cut off?
No, they continued. Architecture programs kept accepting women. It was not a 50-50. It actually became 50-50, I believe, already under independent Ukraine sometime in the late 2000s. And right now it might actually be the other way around, where there are more women studying. That doesn't mean there are more women in the profession later on, but there are more women studying architecture than men. The access to education was open to women in whatever professions, but they usually didn't take high posts. And then you also have to consider their ethnic or class origin, because that would have affected their access to education in general, not just in architecture. May have negatively affected their education chances and work chances.
We have a hand up by Rebecca on Zoom. You wanna go
Yes,
ahead?
but we had, can we first have, you had a question?
Yeah, I think it might have been answered though.
Okay.
I don't know.
Are you sure?
I think you mentioned something about, like, and you we've been talking about it, but women like basically taking over the workforce while the men are deployed or wherever. And like, we just like accepted being displaced when everyone came back. Is that what happened historically? And is that what's happening now?
Oh, well, that is an interesting question. I mean, first of all, right after the war, immediate reconstruction is a very specific kind of need in the USSR. So within that immediate reconstruction, literally, you know, in the larger socialist camp, you might know about the case of Warsaw, where the city was so damaged that they literally had to put it apart brick by brick to then use the brick to reconstruct it. And a lot of that work was done by women and children, because again, no men, or very few men. But that kind of task, it eventually expires, it's eventually done. And then what happens in the Soviet Union after the war is a huge construction boom. So if we're speaking specifically about architecture and construction, there's a huge construction boom that by 1958 results in, you know, in these notorious Soviet neighborhoods that are very repetitive with boxy buildings that are built over and over again. And all of that requires a ton of architects to work on it and a ton of builders. So there's place for everybody. And in fact, when you're looking at the biographies of that generation, there are very few architects who got in trouble for staying under occupation, which is shocking, honestly, because a lot of other people did get in huge trouble for that and were you know, considered enemies of the people, sent to prison camps, executed, and so on. It seems that architects were just so valuable to the state after the war, immediately after the war and later on in less cruel times during Khrushchev's stop, that they always had work. They were never out of work. In terms of now, well, we don't know. Our army is still in the front line, and we have no idea what's going to happen. There's a shortage of qualified everybody in pretty much every industry. So it's very easy to find a job in Ukraine right now. A very nice job, well-paying job.
Yes, go ahead, Rebecca.
That's one of those very ironic phenomena of history being made, just to directly answer your last comment, Katerina. Actually, I wanted to kind of put you on the spotlight because now you're a member of the club, of the IAWA club and the Christine Fallon Prize Club. And we had a very lively discussion this afternoon, or for me this afternoon, for everybody else this morning, that questioning what could be a relevant topic for the next call to participate in the research prize. So, do you have any ideas for us?
I will think about it. I will take my time.
I know.
Carefully.
Don't want to put you on the spot, but do think about it.
Really important. The work that the International Archive is doing, and Kristen Fallon Prize specifically, I don't think I would have had an opportunity to do this, at least not as fast as I was able to do this because of the prize, because of the deadline. To be honest, the deadline really helped. Also because I moved to Ukraine. That's another reason why I was able to do it so fast and so in depth. But yes, I will absolutely thank you for inviting me to this conversation.
Other questions? Maybe, yes, no. I have a lot of things in my head that I don't know that I can compose them coherently, but a loose one was, I was wondering, I believe that the wife of the president of your country is an architect.
I thought she was a scriptwriter.
Okay, I'll look into that.
You know, to be honest, I may not know too much about Zelensky's personal life, but I don't think she's an architect. I think I would know. The architects here tend to know, we all know each other, and we certainly all gossip, and we would have heard.
Yeah.
We're a pretty tight-knit community.
I'll have to check my sources then. I don't know. It was like many years ago, I think when the war first started, that this came up, and we were meeting as the board of advisors, and I think that this was a topic that, you know, came up immediately. What would be lost? What could be lost in the war, aside from, you know, the big life damage and built environment damage, but all the records and such. And I don't know. So I was just remembering that conversation. It's several years old, but I may have had unreliable sources.
She was trained as an architect, but she writes as she works as a scriptwriter, so you're both correct.
Oh, we're both correct.
It's fascinating. I have no idea. I need to look into which school she went to, because that is absolutely new to me. That's fantastic.
I'm glad I could help. Well, I was just wondering, like, from her position, what kind of agency may she have, or I don't know, maybe not. I mean, I really don't. I have not experienced directly a context like you're experiencing now, and so I may be probably very naive, but in my perspective. But I was wondering if there, you know, what are things that can be the importance of networks and you know, getting together for preservation and, well, safety of course first, but preservation of materials and architecture in the city, etc. So I was wondering if there was something there.
You know, let me answer this question in a slightly kind of zigzaggy way. As she has definitely taken on a role of advocacy for mostly for the cases for children's questions, and we have a horrible situation here with the children who were taken from the occupied territories, and she has been doing a lot of work on that specifically. But I think in some ways, as much as it is important that somebody in power has architectural expertise, Ukrainians are an extremely grassroots society. A lot of our architectural descent is based entirely, purely on activism, and very much grassroots activism of architects on the ground in specific cities having lots of opinions. Generally speaking, we have lots of opinions. And I think it's a wonderful thing. We can barely agree with each other. The one thing we agree on is that we have a common enemy. But most of the time, we are extremely democratic. We argue a lot, and the decisions that end up being generally popular and generally accepted by the public are the result of this sort of turmoil of activism, arguing, NGOs working on the same subject from a bunch of different perspectives, everybody disagreeing with everybody. A power figure in this situation could probably cause more damage by telling us what to do than actually help, because everything is so entirely grassroots based.
Right.
And it's, on one hand, it's maddening when you're trying to work in that kind of situation when nobody agrees. On the other hand, I think that's actually democracy. And I absolutely love it. That's why we're not a dictatorship. We basically can't be a dictatorship. We're somehow immune by means of simply disagreeing with each other. And I think it's extremely important to look at NGOs rather than looking at power figures, to look at various participatory projects that are happening in Ukraine right now, to look at a variety of actors, including some international actors that have entered the Ukrainian scene and are truly trying to help, and have been for a long time, and have really learned what they're dealing with, and now have very much real non-humanitarian expertise on what's going on in Ukraine. Rather than one person, we're a bunch of people working towards the same goal.
Yeah, this is quite, yeah. It's quite amazing. As I was listening to your presentation, I was remembering a couple of years ago, I was doing a little bit of research in the archive. I was looking at the work of Hilde Westrom in Berlin, and how she would say that the destruction of Berlin was such an opportunity for her. Like it was her sandbox, her playground for a lot of work and experimentation and exploration. But also what really hit me when you were talking was that the situation you're in now, you do not know how it ends. And so when we look back at Berlin, at Europe, or Ukraine in the past, there's a sense of ending, recovery of a territory, and then you can start thinking about rebuilding. But even now, when you're talking about there are areas that are rebuilding, there's still this unknown, not knowing if it's going to remain, whose territories are going to be in the near future or in the further out future. So it's interesting. It's almost it is like being suspended in suspension until there's a sense of how it ends.
The character of war has changed so much since World War II that we're essentially dealing with a completely different thing at this point. Right. Whereas they were dealing with carpet bombings of cities, we manage our air defense manages to take down a lot of air threats, hence the damage is really, it's wind damage rather than carpet bombing, unless it's at the front line. So that damage can be repaired while we are still suspended.
Right.
And the rest, and all we can do is really just sort of do this future-oriented participatory planning, hoping that the communities will come back, and then if the war is over and when it's over. And it's also been 4 years. It's already been 4 years of just the full scale and 12 years of the war.
Wow.
We live at war.
Wow. Yeah. We have another hand. Rebecca, is that you?
Yeah, that's me again. Actually, I think Katerina kind of gave you the redirective on your question very clearly. It's a completely different world that we are living in terms of warfare, and it's if you want to look at it in a cold, analytical manner, it's new strategies of maintaining the appropriate built environment under fire, under continuous aggression is extremely important. It's become a much more vital issue of how to maintain good space while war is around you, is affecting you. And so you really, even then, it's an issue of how do you maintain your necessary optimism about the built environment, and it's not a 0 hour and now we're going to change the built environment completely. That's an antiquated, absolutely antiquated view of how cities get rebuilt and redeveloped, and it's important because our entire context of how we move forward culturally is become so hybrid. It's a fascinating discussion, and it's not always painless, that discussion, but very necessary.
And it's also, I think, I suppose I want to emphasize that it is a discussion.
Mm-hmm.
We don't actually know. We don't have big answers. The main thing is that reconstruction and war is no excuse for bad architectural solutions. And I think a lot of people are very aware of that in Ukraine right now.
Perfect.
Particularly because we can still look at the heritage of World War II.
Fascinating. Any further questions, comments, any hands in the chat? Okay, well, Kate, thank you so much. This has been an outstanding presentation, and I hope that we continue the conversation, after this presentation as well in the future.
Standing ovation.
Vincent.